So you had no idea what you were getting into tonight, did you? But in all seriousness, we can't thank you enough for being here tonight. We are truly humbled that you would be willing to support us in our ministry in this way. It's hard to even put into words how significant your money is to us and to the many, many individuals that we see that you will probably never even know about or hear about, and because oftentimes it's hard to even put into words our interactions with so many individuals, again, locally, nationally, and even globally. So it is our honor tonight to introduce Adam McHugh of Santa Barbara, California. About a year ago, I was kind of messing around with my personal Twitter feed, still trying to figure out this whole social media world that we live in now, when somebody shared this incredible article with me called "Why Listening Can Be a Gift." The title alone quickly grabbed my attention, so I decided to give it a read. Immediately, I was captivated by the article as the author described, very, very vulnerably, his journey from being a preaching, teaching, upfront type of a personality to being put in situations where he was forced to do something as simple yet profound as listening and entering into other people's pain and brokenness and being fully present. In the article, the author, Adam McHugh, describes his own journey as a pastor who was put in a position as a hospice chaplain where he engaged with a family who had lost a dear family friend, and now he didn't have much to offer other than quite often the most important thing we can offer. And here's a little of what he shared in the article.
I had learned that it is in quiet that we honor the sacred and painful moments of life. I had learned that presence is more than speaking, and that words can be barriers that separate us from others and from entering the moment we are currently living. Adam McHugh grew up in Seattle, Washington. In addition to being a writer, he is also a spiritual director, speaker, retreat leader, ordained pastor, and most recently a sommelier and wine tour guide, a fascinating combination, which we are especially interested in learning about. In fact, how about we just talk about that tonight? Adam has been published in a host of publications and books, including the New York Times, USA Today, Psychology Today, and the Huffington Post. He's even served as a guest chaplain in the United States House of Representatives in 2002. Adam is the author of a book we love called The Listening Life, Embracing Attentiveness in a World of Distraction, and also in the wonderfully selling book, Introverts in the Church, Finding Our Place in an Extroverted Culture. It is our privilege and our pleasure to introduce to you and welcome Adam McHugh tonight.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I am a person who goes around and shares lots of words about listening. I promise you the irony, if it's not clear to you yet, it will hit you in a moment, is exceedingly clear to me. I live that tension every single day. When you count the book that I wrote, The Listening Life, the interviews that I've done, the talks that I have given, I have literally shared hundreds of thousands of words about listening. I call it the Speaking About Listening World Tour. I have proposed on a few occasions for people to pay me to stand up in front of an audience like yourselves and for you to talk to me and for me to listen to you, but no one ever seems to go for that. I guess there's not a lot of money on the listening circuit. What I fear sometimes is that it has actually become easier for me to write and speak about listening than it is for me to actually listen. Even for someone like myself who is thoroughly devoted to the practice of listening, it continues to be a challenge for me to actually practice listening and not to just talk about it. We're all swimming against the tide here. I think that's why we need ministries like someone to tell it to lead us in this arena, because we live in a society that doesn't know how to genuinely listen. And we're all a people, myself included, who struggles to understand the power of true listening. We think that power and courage comes in speaking up, don't we? We assert ourselves and we show others who we are through speech. Our voices have become synonymous with our identities. Who we are is what we say. And as a result of that, we can actually start to associate sitting quietly, listening, not speaking up, as actually insecurity or weakness. Have you ever heard someone else or heard yourself say the phrase, "I just listened"? We've all said it at one time or another, I have. And the problem when we say a phrase like "I just listened" is that we usually don't mean "I only listened." We mean, I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. It may be unintentional, but we're saying that I just listened, it actually becomes dismissive of listening, as though listening is a lesser alternative, a fallback plan when we can't come up with anything else to do, a last-ditch effort when we don't know what to say. But what I want to propose tonight is that listening is actually something that should come first. Listening is not, never will be plan B. Listening is where we begin. You may already know that children are actually able to hear before they are born. There's a reason why everyone's always talking to mama's belly. It's because her unborn child can actually hear the voices of her parents and others who are speaking, and even slowly start to recognize those voices. Hearing is the first sense we develop in life. Even before we are born, we are listeners. And you may also know, I didn't know this until more recently, that hearing is the last sense that goes when we are dying. That's what I learned when I served for a few years as a hospice chaplain. People lose their sight, they lose their sense of smell, they even lose their ability to respond in any way, but they can still hear. And that's why I always told the family members of the patients that I was working with to keep speaking, to keep singing, to keep whispering into the ears of their family members, because they could still hear even if they weren't able to respond. So listening is the first thing we do in life, and it's the last thing we do in death. We are born as listeners, and we die as listeners. Let that sink in for a moment. The beginning point of our lives and the end point of our lives are marked by listening. Yet for all of those points in between, when listening is a choice, we struggle, don't we? At some point, something goes wrong for all of us. And that's why I think that even though we are born into the world with the sense of hearing, that listeners in between those 2 points are always something that we must become. We may be born with the sense of hearing, but we are not born innately to be listeners. Listeners are always people that we have to become. I wasn't always a good listener. In fact, listening is a relatively new thing in my life, to be honest with you. I was pretty much forced into it. After I graduated from seminary, I took a position at a church where I was preaching and teaching to college students and young adults every week. And everything was going according to my plan. I had all these gifts and words, and I thought that my contributions to the world were in the words that I bring to others. The quality, the impact, the insight that those words had. Whenever I walked into a room, whatever room I walked into, I thought about how could my words add meaning and value to this room. That was how I identified myself. In order to become an ordained minister in my denomination, and that was my goal, because after all, I wanted to showcase all of my glamorous words to as many people as possible, I had to undergo a 4-month internship as a chaplain at a local hospital. Believe me, I put it off as long as I could. I dreaded it. I was terrified, honestly, of it. But eventually, that ambition that I had won out. Though, as I look back on it, I realized that my ambition might have been a pawn in that little game. I think my ambition got duped back then by a larger purpose and a larger plan. I think my ambition was my ring of power that led me to Mount Doom. 2 things happened that fall. It was the fall of 2003. Number 1, I sat with patients on the oncology floor of St. Joseph's Hospital in the city of Orange, California. Most of my patients were undergoing chemotherapy or were suffering from advanced stages of cancer. And I was watching many of them slowly slip away. And I, Mr. Wordsmith, had absolutely nothing to say. I had no input to offer, no insight to share, no great wisdom that was going to make people better or even make them feel emotionally better. I learned that fall that words in situations of pain and loss and grief have a way of falling flat. And in fact, in many cases, they make things worse. And so I sat quietly next to the beds of those patients with cancer, and I listened. I didn't try to talk them out of their pain. I didn't tell them to look on the bright side. I didn't preach any mini sermons at the bedside. I didn't tell them that God works all things for good. I offered them my presence, and I listened, because that was what I had to offer. And that was also the season that the phrase, "I just listened," left my vocabulary forever. As part of that internship, I had to work a few Saturdays on call, which meant that I was the only available chaplain in the hospital. So what I would do is you sit in the chaplain's office for 8 hours during that shift, and you listen for what's being said on the hospital loudspeaker. So if the operator called for a chaplain for some sort of spiritual support or emotional support, that was my cue. But also, if the operator called code blue, I was also to respond. So the nurses and doctors in that situation would rush to the patient who was coding, who was flatlining, but it was my responsibility to rush to the family, if they were there, to search out the family of that patient and offer my support to them. And I remember thinking to myself, sitting there on the couch of that chaplain's office, thinking, yeah, that's great, but who's going to respond to the code blue when the chaplain intern passes out on the floor of the ICU? Well, it was mid-afternoon one Saturday when the call came. I was summoned to the ICU to be with a large Hispanic family who was losing their grandfather, their abuelo. I remember I was shaking as I pushed the curtain aside and greeted the family. And I remember, if you can picture this, I remember they all turned their heads toward me, looked at me, said nothing, turned their heads back toward the bed. There was one woman sitting over at the bedside, an older woman who gave me sort of a half smile and nodded a little bit and then turned back to the patient as well. And that was all the response that I got in that initial moment. And so I stood there, paralyzed, unable to move, no idea what to do. I remember I asked a couple of awkward questions at the beginning, and I got very awkward 3-word responses. And so I went silent, and I stood there. I think I had some sort of chaplain-like prayer posture that I was standing with, something like this, over by the curtain. There was about 20 people in this little curtained room. And I felt like we were there for about an hour. It was about 7 minutes, I think, but it felt like an hour. It was interminable. We sat there and we watched the chest of the patient go up and down, and you could hear the sound of his pulse on the machine next to the bed. And we sat there and watched his breath, listened to the pulse until it stopped. I stayed with the family a few minutes as they grieved and wept. And then I gave a brief condolence, and then I made my escape. And I went back. This is one of the pivotal moments of my ministry. I went back and I fell onto this couch in the chaplain's office. And I sat there in the fetal position for probably a half hour. And I just remember thinking to myself, maybe saying out loud, what am I doing with my life? I do not belong here. The next week, when I got into the office, and I'll be honest, there were a couple of days when I thought I would not be returning to the office, I got a card in my box from the wife of the patient who had died. So it was the grandmother, the older woman, that sort of gave me a half smile when she was sitting by the bedside. And the card read, "Thank you for being with us in our time of loss. You are part of our family now." The second thing that happened during that internship was I met an authority figure who listened to me. Before that time, I had assumed that listening was largely positional, by which I mean that your position in relationship to other people determines whether you were required to listen to them. So the person on the lower rung listens to the person on the higher rung. So if you're below another person in terms of age or education or status or any other sort of measure, then you were supposed to listen to them. So children listen to adults, students listen to teachers, congregations listen to ministers, employees listen to bosses, etc., etc. There's like this listening pyramid, and everyone on the bottom is required to listen to people on the rungs above them. And as you climb that pyramid, you are required to listen to fewer and fewer people. I think history honestly has largely borne out that theory, that the more power you acquire, the less obligated you are to listen to other people. But don't worry, that doesn't happen in a democracy. A woman named Donna Herrick, flipped all of that the listening pyramid on its head for me. She was my supervisor and mentor during that chaplain internship. And we met every Wednesday afternoon for an hour and a half, our supervisor meetings. And as I went into that first meeting in that September of 2003 fall, I braced myself for the typical instruction and advice and correction that I had received from other authority figures in my life. But that day, I encountered a different kind of leadership. I met an authority figure who listened to me. Donna was interested in who I am, what my family was like, what I thought and what I felt, what I was passionate about, what wounds I carried. She asked me questions, and then she actually cared about the responses. It's one thing to ask questions, it's another thing to actually pay attention to your answers. And then she remembered them in our subsequent meetings. And she didn't just ask the first question, she asked the second and the third and the fourth question. Everyone can ask the first question. It's the second question that starts to change things. Here was an authority figure who didn't view me as her project, who wasn't trying to mold me into her own image, wasn't trying to fix me. She saw me as a person, as my own individual person. And the impact that had on me just changed everything for me, without hyperbole. It put me on this road to listening that I have continued to walk to this day. And as powerful as my experiences with my patients were that fall, my relationship with Donna was the one that made the greatest impact. And there is no greater gift that we can offer to other people than the gift to be themselves. There's no greater gift we can offer than the gift to be yourself. And that is what genuine listening does. Has anyone ever done that for you? Has anyone ever surprised you with listening? Have you ever done that for others? There's another lesson that Donna taught me about listening. It became this little refrain that we repeated to each other that fall. And that was, stay in the feeling. 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 And the reason why Donna had me say that over and over again was that she very quickly, alarmingly quickly, picked up on the fact that I ran away from feelings, both those of others and myself. Stay in the feeling, Adam. Stay in the feeling. She said that to me countless times. We will not be good listeners, especially when we are listening to those who are struggling, if we are unable to stay in the feeling. When someone is expressing hurt or grief or disappointment or anger or doubt to you, how do you respond? Do you dismiss it? Do you judge them for feeling what they are feeling? Do you try to argue them out of that feeling? That's what I used to do. I would tell them in one way or another that their feeling does not correspond with reality, or that they're just not seeing their situation accurately. I would try and logic them out of their feelings. Or sometimes I would try and get them to laugh. I would try to blow off their feelings with humor, which may be temporarily effective, but which has no lasting impact on what is causing the feeling. But my personal favorite during those early days of pastoral work was I would try and pray the feelings out of people. I was the feelings exorcist. I would try and cast out your feelings. If your prayers start sounding a lot like sermons, you might be doing the same thing. And in all of those strategies, I was doing the same thing. I would be telling people to stop feeling what they're feeling. And why was that? Well, because their feelings were freaking me out. I was intimidated by intense emotion. I was deeply uncomfortable when people expressed something vulnerable and real with me. But that, my friends, is my issue. It is not the issue of the other person. It is not the fault of another person for making us feel uncomfortable with their emotions. That issue is mine and mine alone. And the truth is that if we want to be people who are able to genuinely listen to others, then we're going to also have to listen to what is happening inside of ourselves, to those deep and uncomfortable and vulnerable parts of ourselves that might prevent us from being able to listen to others. Back in those days, deep emotion made me feel anxious, like I was losing control of the situation. And that was terrifying to me, even though I might not have known it or put it in those words. And I believe that anxiety is the greatest obstacle to deep and genuine listening. When people are vulnerable with us, when they share the deepest and sometimes even the darkest parts of their lives and hearts with us, it inevitably stirs up our own anxiety. We hear our vulnerability, our struggle, and theirs. And I am convinced, actually, that the hardest people to listen to on a deep level are those whom we love most. It's easier to listen to a stranger than it is to listen to the people that we live with. And that's because no one provokes our anxiety like those whom we love. It's just the truth. When they're upset, it disrupts our lives as well. When they're hurting, it jeopardizes our sense of well-being as well. When they're questioning the direction of their lives, they're questioning the direction of our lives. Their disquiet provokes our anxiety, our fears for the future, our unresolved questions. So that's when we start trying to argue people out of their feelings. That's why we tell them to look on the bright side, or when we try to distract them with humor, or we search for the perfect phrase or cliche or prayer that will make them feel better and that will take away their pain. We want to fix, we want to rescue them so that we can right this wobbling ship and we can go back to that good place of land where we're in control again. And honestly, that's why so many of our attempts at listening, I think, sort of result in self-therapy. We want to make others feel better so that we can feel better. There's a quote that's famously attributed to Dr. Seuss. It's one of those quotes that no one's ever really found where he wrote it, but for some reason his name is always attached to it. The phrase is this: "Don't cry that it's over. Smile that it happened." No. I'd rather eat green eggs and ham than listen to that quote. Our role as listeners, my friends, is to let people cry that it's over, but in the presence of another person. To let people cry that it's over, but not to be alone. Stay in the feeling. Don't try and take people's feelings away. In some cases, it's all that they have. Well, as I draw to a close tonight, let me say a couple of things. First, thank you for your support of Someone to Tell It To and Michael and Tom and their expanding group. By all means, please continue to support their ministry. They are doing a unique and profound work, not only in listening to people in the most harrowing and dire moments of their lives, but they're setting an example of listening. They're teaching all of us how to listen. And second, remember that listeners are always people who we are in the process of becoming. And the best way to start becoming a listener, the best way I know how to start becoming a listener is to listen. Is to listen to one person at a time. Mother Teresa once said, "Never worry about numbers. Help one person at a time and start with the person nearest you." If you're feeling compelled to grow into becoming a listener tonight and you don't know where to start, start by listening to the person right in front of you. Thank you very much.